"Keep the change," the man in the bespoke Italian suit murmured, his voice a low, dangerous velvet that barely carried over the clinking of crystal. He didn't look at Stella. He simply let a single, crumpled $1 bill flutter from his perfectly manicured fingers. It landed softly in a small puddle of spilled ice water on the pristine mahogany table. Around them, the high-end dining room went dead silent. Everyone knew who Justin was. Everyone knew what a gesture like this meant from a man who casually tipped in hundreds. It was a targeted, deliberate execution of a person's dignity. Stella stared at the wet, dissolving paper. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with a sudden, blinding rage. "I think you need this more than I do," she whispered. The evening had begun like any other Friday night at Lara, the city's most exclusive dining establishment, where the chandeliers dripped with imported crystal and the air smelled faintly of truffles and old money. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was a stark contrast. A frantic, sweltering symphony of clattering pans, shouting chefs, and the relentless hiss of open flames. Through this orchestrated chaos moved Stella, a waitress whose uniform was always immaculately pressed, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, uncompromising bun. She was an island of absolute calm in a sea of culinary panic. She had to be. At 24, Stella was carrying a weight that would have crushed someone twice her age, and she could not afford a single mistake. When the front doors opened at exactly 8 o'clock, the temperature in the dining room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The maitre d', a usually unflappable man named Henri, visibly paled. A hushed murmur rippled through the seated patrons, dying out almost as quickly as it began, leaving behind a suffocating, heavy silence. Justin had arrived. He moved with the effortless, predatory grace of a man who owned not just the building, but the very streets that surrounded it. Flanked by 3 men whose tailored suits failed to hide the bulk of their broad shoulders, Justin was a portrait of lethal elegance. His eyes, the color of a winter ocean, swept over the room, taking in every detail, every trembling hand, every averted gaze. He commanded a specific kind of terror, the quiet, absolute certainty that crossing him meant losing everything. He was the undisputed head of the city's most powerful underground syndicate, a mafia boss who operated in the daylight, cloaked in corporate legitimacy. Henri practically tripped over himself, leading Justin to the best table in the house, a secluded alcove bathed in soft, golden light. When it came time to assign a server, the rest of the waitstaff suddenly found urgent tasks in the kitchen. A young waiter named Thomas was hyperventilating near the espresso machine. Henri turned his desperate eyes to Stella. "Stella, please," Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "Just give him whatever he wants. Do not make eye contact unless he speaks to you. Do not breathe too loudly." Stella wiped her hands on her apron, her expression unreadable. "It's just a table, Henri. He's just a man who wants dinner." She approached the alcove with a steady, measured pace. She poured the ice water without spilling a single drop, her hand steady as a surgeon's. She recited the evening specials with perfect diction, her voice a calm, soothing melody. Justin did not look at her once. He spoke to his associates in low, clipped tones, ignoring her presence entirely. When it was time to order, he simply pointed at the menu, a dismissive flick of his wrist. For the next 2 hours, Stella executed a flawless ballet of service. She anticipated their every need, clearing plates before they registered they were finished, refilling wine glasses with a vintage Bordeaux that cost more than her month's rent. The tension at the table was thick enough to carve, but Stella moved through it like a ghost, an invisible servant ensuring perfection. She was exhausted. Her feet throbbed, and the familiar ache in her lower back was radiating up her spine, but she held her posture perfectly straight. She needed the tip. She needed the money more than she needed air. As the meal concluded, Justin finally looked up. His icy gaze locked onto Stella for the first time. There was nothing in his eyes, no warmth, no recognition of her hard work. Only a cold, calculating emptiness. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a money clip thick with $100 bills. The other men at the table watched with faint, cruel smiles playing on their lips. Stella stood by, holding the leather folio containing the exorbitant bill. She kept her face perfectly neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Justin peeled off a single, crumpled $1 bill. It was dirty, torn at the corner, an ugly contrast to the pristine environment. He didn't hand it to her. He didn't place it in the folio. Instead, He looked her dead in the eye, a sneer curling the edge of his perfectly chiseled mouth, and let it drop. It fluttered down, landing with a soft, pathetic slap into a small puddle of condensation that had dripped from a water glass onto the dark mahogany wood. The green ink immediately began to soak up the water, turning dark and soggy. "Keep the change," Justin murmured. The silence that followed was deafening. The men at the table chuckled. A low, ugly sound. It was a masterclass in humiliation. He wasn't just undertipping her. He was showing her exactly what he thought her perfect service, her quiet dignity, and her very existence were worth. Garbage. A wet, discarded piece of trash. Stella's breath caught in her throat. The heat of 1,000 humiliating moments in her life rushed to her cheeks, but she bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. She reached down, her fingers brushing the cold wood, and picked up the wet, limp dollar bill. It felt heavy in her hand. It felt like a death sentence. She looked up at Justin, whose eyes were already moving past her, dismissing her back to the invisible realm of the help. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper, tight and strained. She turned on her heel and walked away, feeling the eyes of the entire restaurant burning into her spine, carrying the wet dollar bill like a branding iron. The clock in the employee locker room ticked with agonizing slowness. Reading 2:15 a.m. Stella sat on the unforgiving wooden bench, her uniform still on, staring at the concrete floor. The restaurant was finally empty. The last of the clattering dishes silenced. The grand chandeliers plunged into darkness. The only light in the room came from a flickering fluorescent bulb overhead, casting long bruised shadows across Stella's exhausted face. She opened her tightly clenched fist. Resting on her palm was the crumpled, waterlogged $1 bill. It had dried slightly during the last few hours of her shift, becoming stiff and warped. The portrait of George Washington twisted into a mocking grimace. A single tear hot with suppressed fury tracked through the light dusting of makeup on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, splashing silently against her dark apron. It wasn't just the insult that burned. It was the terrifying math running through her head. She had mentally allocated the anticipated tip from that high roller table toward a very specific, non-negotiable expense. Without it, the delicate house of cards she called a life was going to collapse. With a heavy sigh, Stella changed into her street clothes, faded jeans, a worn wool sweater, and a heavy coat that did little to block the damp, coastal chill of the city. She stepped out of the service entrance into the alleyway. The night was bitter, a fine mist of rain slicking the cobblestones and casting haloed reflections beneath the street lamps. She pulled her collar up and began the long walk to the bus stop. The bus ride was a solitary purgatory. The vehicle was nearly empty, save for a few other night shift ghosts staring blankly at the passing neon signs. The rhythmic thrum of the engine vibrated through the worn seat, settling deep into her aching bones. Stella pressed her forehead against the cold, rattling glass of the window, watching the glittering high-rises of the financial district fade into the grim, gray blocks of the city's underbelly. This was the divide. Men like Justin lived in the clouds, dropping wet dollar bills for amusement, while she scraped the pavement below just to survive. She finally reached her apartment building, a crumbling brick monolith where the elevator hadn't worked in a decade. She climbed 4 flights of stairs, her legs feeling like lead, and unlocked the battered door to apartment 4B. The moment she stepped inside, the oppressive smell of age and stale cooking oil was overwhelmed by the quiet, rhythmic hiss-click, coming from the small corner bedroom. Stella dropped her keys on the counter and walked softly into the room. A small nightlight cast a gentle blue glow over the bed. Lying there, looking impossibly small amidst a tangle of transparent tubes and humming machinery, was her 7-year-old brother, Leo. His chest rose and fell in time with the mechanical ventilator. He was sleeping peacefully, his pale skin translucent in the dim light. Stella knelt by the bed, reaching out to gently brush a lock of damp hair from his forehead. Her heart physically ached at the sight of him. This was her entire world. This was why she worked double shifts, why she swallowed her pride, why she endured the screaming chefs and the entitled patrons. The medical bills were a tidal wave, and the specialized filtration system keeping Leo's compromised lungs functioning was an ocean of debt on its own. The supplier had called yesterday. If she didn't have the $3,000 installment by Monday, they would come for the machine. She had counted on tonight. Justin's table was supposed to be her saving grace. Stella stood up and walked back into the tiny, cramped kitchen. She sat at the chipped formica table and pulled the warped $1 bill from her pocket. She placed it under the harsh light of the ceiling fixture. It looked so pathetic. $1. It wouldn't buy a cup of coffee. It wouldn't buy a fraction of a second of the oxygen Leo needed. It was nothing but a symbol of her absolute powerlessness. A profound, blinding anger began to boil in her chest. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a tantrum. It was a cold, terrifyingly clear fury. She had spent her entire life apologizing, shrinking, surviving by being invisible. She had let the world step on her, believing that endurance was a virtue. But as she stared at that crumpled piece of paper, something inside her finally snapped. Endurance wasn't saving her brother. Submission wasn't paying the bills. Men like Justin believed they could buy anyone's dignity, that they could crush a soul for mere amusement and face no consequences because the world was terrified of them. "Not my soul," Stella whispered to the empty room. "Not today." She stood up, her movements suddenly sharp and purposeful. She went to the closet and pulled out a small, travel-sized ironing board and a rusty iron. She set it up in the kitchen, plugged it in, and waited for it to heat. When the metal was dangerously hot, she took the wrinkled, water-damaged dollar bill and placed it on the board. She pressed the hot iron down heavily, moving it back and forth, forcing the heat into the fibers. Steam rose from the damp paper. She ironed it until it was bone dry, until the wrinkles were forced out, until the bill was as stiff and crisp as the day it was printed. She held it up to the light. It was no longer a wet piece of trash. It was a statement. She walked over to her battered laptop, opened it, and began to search. It wasn't hard to find him. Men with that much power always had a public face. Justin operated out of a massive, sleek skyscraper downtown, running a logistics and import firm that served as the impenetrable fortress for his empire. Stella checked the clock. It was 4:00 a.m. She had a few hours until the sun came up. She didn't sleep. She sat in a chair by Leo's bed, listening to his breathing, clutching the crisp $1 bill in her hand until her knuckles turned white. She was terrified. She knew she was walking into a lion's den, that she was risking her life for a point of pride. But as she looked at her brother, she knew she had to do it. If she let this man break her spirit, she would have nothing left to fight for Leo with. She had to take her power back. The morning sun reflected harshly off the towering glass facade of the Apex Tower, blinding Stella as she approached. This was the heart of Justin's legitimate empire, a towering monolith of steel and tinted windows that scraped the sky, a stark contrast to the crumbling brick of her own neighborhood. It was designed to make you feel small, insignificant, an insect approaching a god. Stella stood on the sprawling concrete plaza, the wind whipping her coat around her legs. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold air filling her lungs. She had dressed with meticulous care in her only business suit, a thrift store find that she had tailored herself. It was simple, charcoal gray, and perfectly pressed. She wore her hair in its usual tight bun, her spine straight, her chin held high. In her right pocket, her fingers traced the sharp, crisp edges of the ironed $1 bill. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors and entered a lobby that echoed with the sound of expensive leather shoes on imported Italian marble. The ceiling was vaulting, the walls paneled in dark wood. Behind a massive, curved reception desk of polished granite stood 2 security guards. They didn't look like standard rent-a-cops. They wore custom-fitted suits, earpieces, and possessed the cold, dead eyes of men who had seen and done terrible things. Stella walked directly toward them, her heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. The sound was loud, purposeful. The guards noticed her immediately, their postures stiffening. "Can I help you, miss?" the taller one asked, his voice a gravelly rumble. He was already assessing her as a threat, his eyes scanning her for weapons. "I am here to see Justin," Stella said. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding her system. She used only his first name, a deliberate choice to strip away the titles he hid behind. The guard's eyebrows twitched. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Then you're not seeing him. Have a good day." He turned his attention back to his monitor, dismissing her with the same casual arrogance his boss had shown the night before. Stella didn't move. She leaned slightly over the granite counter. "You are going to call up to his office. You are going to tell him that the waitress from Laura is downstairs. And you are going to tell him that if he doesn't see me now, I will stand in the middle of this lobby and scream until the police arrive, and I will let them drag me out of here while I tell every reporter with a scanner exactly who runs this building." The guard slowly looked back up at her. The amusement had vanished from his eyes, replaced by a dangerous, calculating chill. He reached under his jacket, a subtle movement that made Stella's blood run cold. She had pushed too far. Before he could act, the second guard placed a hand on his arm. He had been listening to his earpiece. "Hold on," the second guard murmured. He looked at Stella with a mixture of confusion and begrudging respect. "Top floor. The elevator on the far right. It's an express." Stella let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She gave a curt nod and walked toward the designated elevator. The doors slid open with a whisper, revealing an interior paneled in mirrored glass and brass. She stepped inside, and the doors closed, sealing her in. The ascent was terrifyingly fast, pressing her down into her shoes, making her stomach drop. She watched the floor numbers blur past on the digital display. 50, 60, 75. With a soft chime, the doors parted. Stella stepped out into a sprawling, open-plan penthouse office. The entire far wall was floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a dizzying, panoramic view of the city sprawled out beneath the clouds. The room was sparsely decorated in shades of slate and chrome. It was a room devoid of warmth, a room designed purely for power. Behind a massive desk of polished obsidian sat Justin. He was wearing a crisp white shirt, the collar open, his jacket draped over the back of his chair. He was reading a file, looking completely unbothered by the fact that a waitress had breached his fortress. Two men, built like brick walls, stood in the shadows near the corners of the room. Justin didn't look up as she approached. He let her walk the entire agonizing distance from the elevator to his desk in silence. Only when she stopped, her toes mere inches from the polished obsidian, did he slowly raise his eyes. Those winter ocean eyes locked onto hers. Up close, they were even more terrifying. There was an absolute stillness in him, a terrifying absence of human empathy. "You have exactly 1 minute to explain why you are not currently being thrown out of a window," Justin said, his voice a soft, silken threat. Stella didn't flinch. The fear that had been gnawing at her insides suddenly evaporated, replaced by the same cold, burning clarity she had felt in her kitchen at 4 a.m. She reached into her pocket. The two men in the corners instantly tensed, their hands dropping to their sides. Justin raised a single finger, stopping them. Stella pulled her hand from her pocket. Slowly, deliberately, she placed the perfectly crisp, perfectly flat $1 bill on the center of the obsidian desk. Justin looked down at it. A tiny, almost imperceptible frown creased his forehead. He recognized the bill. He recognized the tear in the corner. "You left this on my table last night," Stella said, her voice ringing out clear and strong in the cavernous room. "I believe you dropped it by mistake." Justin leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He studied her, truly looking at her for the first time. He noted the cheap fabric of her suit, the dark circles under her eyes, the rigid set of her jaw. "It wasn't a mistake. I know," Stella replied instantly. "It was a message. It was you telling me that my time, my effort, and my dignity are worth nothing to you. It was you attempting to make me feel small so that you could feel large." She leaned forward slightly, resting her knuckles on his desk. She was breaking every rule of survival, crossing a line that men had died for crossing. "But you don't get to decide what my dignity is worth," Stella continued, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with raw, unadulterated power. "You have money, you have power, you have men who will kill for you, but you do not have me. I work hard, I bleed for everything I have, and I will not allow a man who hides behind his wealth to treat me like garbage to inflate his own ego." She tapped her finger on the crisp dollar bill. "I pressed this. I ironed the water out of it. Because I wanted you to see it clearly. I don't want your money, Justin. And I certainly don't want your pity. You keep this. Buy yourself some manners." She held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, refusing to look away, refusing to submit. Then, without another word, she turned her back on the most dangerous man in the city and walked slowly, deliberately, back toward the elevator. She didn't run. She didn't look over her shoulder. She expected a bullet in her back with every step she took. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside, only as the doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the penthouse, did she finally collapse against the mirrored wall. Gasping for air as her entire body began to shake violently, the silence in the penthouse was absolute, thick and heavy like water before a storm. The two bodyguards in the shadows remained entirely motionless, their eyes fixed on their boss, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence. No one, not rival bosses, not federal prosecutors, not politicians, had ever spoken to Justin like that and walked out of the room alive. Justin did not move. He sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair, his eyes locked on the single, crisp $1 bill resting in the exact center of his obsidian desk. Minutes passed. The digital clock on the wall shifted silently. Still, Justin stared at the piece of paper. He felt a sensation in his chest that he hadn't experienced in over a decade. Shock. It wasn't the shallow surprise of a sudden noise, but a deep, seismic jolt that rattled the foundations of the reality he had built around himself. He had constructed an empire on the premise that everyone had a price, that everyone could be broken by fear or bought by greed. Power was absolute. Weakness was a choice. But the woman who had just walked out of his office, she had neither fear nor greed. She had walked into the jaws of death just to return a single dollar bill. She had looked him in the eye and stripped away his money, his men, and his myth, reducing him to exactly what he had tried to reduce her to, an arrogant small man. Slowly, Justin reached out and picked up the dollar bill. It was incredibly stiff, almost like cardboard. She had literally ironed it. The absurdity of the act, the sheer domestic violence of pressing the water out of the paper just to hurl it back in his face, struck him with physical force. He rubbed his thumb over the portrait of Washington. As he did, a memory, sharp and jagged, pierced through his carefully cultivated armor, the smell of antiseptic, the rhythmic, maddening beep of a heart monitor, the blinding white lights of a charity ward, a doctor with tired eyes holding a clipboard, telling a young, desperate Justin that without the experimental treatment, a treatment that required cash up front, cash he didn't have, his mother's heart would simply stop. The feeling of begging, the feeling of being looked right through by wealthy hospital administrators. The absolute, soul-crushing humiliation of being poor in a world that only respected gold. Justin closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the dollar bill until his knuckles cracked. He had sworn that day, standing over his mother's cooling body, that he would never be powerless again. He had built his criminal empire not out of a love for violence, but out of a desperate, blinding need to control his environment. He had become the monster to ensure he was never the victim, and in doing so, he realized with a sickening lurch of his stomach, he had become the very thing he hated. He had become the arrogant, wealthy man looking right through the desperate, struggling worker. He had tried to break Stella for the simple sin of existing in his space. "Marcus," Justin said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. The larger of the two bodyguards stepped out of the shadows immediately. "Boss, do you want me to bring her back? Or should I just—" He left the violent implication hanging in the air. "No," Justin snapped, his eyes flashing open. The sudden ferocity in his voice made the massive bodyguard take a half step back. Justin smoothed the crumpled dollar bill out on his desk again. He took a deep breath, reasserting the cold control that had kept him alive this long. "I want to know everything about her," Justin commanded. "Her name is Stella. She works at Laura. I want her address, her background, her bank records, her phone logs. I want to know where she buys her groceries and what time she turns off her lights at night. I want a complete profile on my desk by sunset." "Understood." Marcus nodded, quickly retreating from the room to make the calls. Justin turned his chair to face the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city. He ruled this concrete jungle, but suddenly, the view felt hollow. He had expected to feel anger toward the waitress. He had expected his wounded pride to demand retribution, but instead, as he held that stiff iron dollar bill, all he felt was an agonizing, burning curiosity. Who was she? What kind of fire forged a person who could stare down a loaded gun for the sake of a single dollar? By 6 p.m., a thick manila folder was placed on Justin's desk. He opened it under the glow of a brass desk lamp. The glow illuminated pages of sterile data, but to Justin's trained eye, it painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture. He read about the double shifts. He read about the eviction notices barely staved off month by month. He saw the grocery store receipts, rice, beans, cheap pasta, nothing fresh. And then he turned the page and saw the medical records. Leo, age 7. Chronic pulmonary fibrosis. Requires continuous mechanical ventilation and high-grade air filtration. Justin stared at the medical debt tally. It was astronomical. It was a number that would bankrupt a moderately successful business, let alone a waitress working for tips. He saw the notice from the medical supply company, stamped in red ink. Final notice. Repossession scheduled for Monday. A cold, heavy stone settled in Justin's gut. The irony was so thick he could choke on it. He had dropped that wet dollar bill to remind her of her place, not realizing that she was fighting the exact same war he had fought and lost 15 years ago. She was standing in front of the abyss, fighting for someone she loved, armed with nothing but a tray and a cheap uniform. And she had risked it all, risked her life, risked her brother's only source of income just to protect her dignity. Justin closed the folder. He looked at the ironed dollar bill resting on top of it. He had spent his life breaking people to see what was inside them. He had assumed Stella was glass, fragile, and easily shattered, but she wasn't glass. She was a diamond, and he had thrown her into the mud. The atmosphere inside Leroy was electric with a terrified, vibrating energy. It was Saturday night, the busiest shift of the week, but the usual hum of wealthy conversation was muted. Every eye in the dining room kept darting toward the secluded alcove in the corner. Justin was back. He sat alone this time, devoid of his usual phalanx of muscle. He wore a dark, tailored suit, devoid of a tie, looking less like a mafia boss and more like a solitary, dangerous predator resting in the shadows. He had specifically requested the alcove. He had specifically requested Stella. In the kitchen, Henri was practically pulling his hair out. "He's going to kill us," the maitre d' hissed, pacing back and forth near the swinging doors. He came back to finish it. "Stella, you have to go home. Sneak out the back. I will tell him you're sick." Stella stood at the prep counter, meticulously polishing a crystal wine glass. Her face was a mask of pale, resolute stone. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. The adrenaline from her confrontation at his office had burned off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a creeping dread about Monday's repossession. But she would not run. If she ran, she admitted defeat. "I am not leaving, Henri," Stella said, setting the glass down with a firm click. "It's my section. I will serve him." She picked up her tray, pushed through the swinging doors, and walked into the dining room. She felt the eyes of her coworkers on her, felt the heavy, suffocating silence of the patrons. She walked straight to the alcove, her posture impossibly straight, her chin held high. Justin watched her approach. His face was unreadable. "Good evening," Stella said, her voice smooth and professional, devoid of any inflection. "Would you care to see the wine list?" "No," Justin said. His voice was quieter than she remembered, lacking the venom from the previous night. "Bring me the 2005 Barolo. And the filet. Rare. No sides." Right away, Stella turned and walked off. The service that followed was a grueling psychological dance. Justin didn't ignore her this time. Instead, he watched her every move. When she poured the wine, he stared at her hands, looking for a tremor. There was none. When she placed the steaming steak in front of him, he met her eyes, searching for a flicker of fear or anger. She gave him nothing but the polite, empty smile of a professional server. He pushed his plate away after 2 bites. "The meat is tough," he said softly. It was a lie. It was a prime cut, cooked to absolute perfection. It was a test. He was baiting her, trying to see if the fiery woman who had stormed his office would break her professional veneer in front of a crowded room. Stella didn't blink. She smoothly picked up the plate. "I apologize, sir. I will have the kitchen prepare a fresh one immediately." She walked away, feeling his gaze burning a hole between her shoulder blades. In the kitchen, the chef nearly had a heart attack when she returned the plate, but she simply ordered a refire and waited. When she brought the second steak, Justin cut into it, took a single bite, and set his fork down. Now it's overcooked. It was perfectly rare, bleeding onto the white porcelain. "I apologize again," Stella said, her voice remaining perfectly even, though a muscle feathered in her jaw. "Would you prefer to order something else?" "No," Justin said, leaning back in his chair. Just bring the check. Stella brought the leather folio. She placed it on the table. This was the moment. This was where he would either drop another dollar or pull a weapon. The air in the alcove felt incredibly thin. Justin opened the folio. He reached into his jacket. He didn't pull out the money clip. Instead, he pulled out a black, sleek fountain pen. He wrote something on the receipt, closed the folio, and stood up. He looked at Stella, standing perfectly still, waiting for the blow. For a fraction of a second, the cold, dead mask of the Mafia boss slipped. Something flashed in his winter ocean eyes, something that looked dangerously like respect. "Have a good night, Stella," he said softly. It was the first time he had used her name. He turned and walked out of the restaurant. Stella stood frozen for a long moment, the adrenaline crashing through her system in violent waves. She slowly reached out with trembling fingers and opened the leather folio. There was no cash inside. The receipt was signed. On the tip line, Justin had written a single 0. But at the bottom of the receipt, in sharp, elegant handwriting, he had written a message. "Strength without power is a tragedy. Let's see how long you can carry the world." Stella stared at the words, a cold shiver racing down her spine. He wasn't trying to humiliate her anymore. He was analyzing her. He was playing a game, and she had just realized she didn't even know the rules. She crumpled the receipt in her fist, throwing it into the nearest trash can. She didn't care about his games. She only cared about surviving until Monday. Sunday was a nightmare disguised as a day of rest. The sky outside Stella's apartment window was a bruised, weeping gray, pouring relentless rain against the glass. Inside, the rhythmic hiss-click of Leo's ventilator sounded louder than ever. A mechanical countdown to disaster. Stella sat on the worn rug beside her brother's bed, her knees pulled to her chest. She was surrounded by scattered papers, bank statements, pawn shop receipts, payday loan applications. All of them ended in the same terrifying word: denied. She had emptied her meager savings, sold her mother's silver necklace, and even asked Henri for an advance, which he sorrowfully declined. She was short. She was exactly $1,000 short of the installment needed to keep the machine. Tomorrow at 9 a.m., the medical supply company would send a technician and 2 security guards to repossess the unit. Without it, Leo's lungs would slowly fill with fluid. He would suffocate in his own bed. Panic, dark and suffocating, clawed at her throat. She pressed her face into her knees, trying to muffle the sound of her own ragged breathing. She couldn't let Leo wake up and see her like this. She had always been his shield, projecting absolute confidence that everything would be okay. But the shield was cracking. Unable to stay in the apartment, Stella grabbed her coat and rushed out into the rain. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed air. She walked blindly through the slick streets, the cold rain soaking through her thin coat, freezing her to the bone. She found herself in a small, desolate park near the industrial district, the skeletal remains of dead trees clawing at the sky. She collapsed onto a wet, wooden bench and finally broke. The tears she had held back for years, the terror she had swallowed daily, the sheer, crushing exhaustion of fighting a war she was destined to lose it all, flooded out of her in violent, wrenching sobs. She screamed into the empty park, a raw, primal sound of absolute despair. She had fought so hard. She had kept her dignity intact. But dignity couldn't buy oxygen. She was so consumed by her grief that she didn't notice the black SUV idling in the shadows across the street. Inside the vehicle, Marcus sat behind the wheel, watching the woman fall apart in the rain. Beside him, in the passenger seat, a younger associate held a long-lens camera, documenting the scene. "Boss is going to want to see this," the associate murmured. Clicking the shutter, Marcus frowned, his thick brow furrowing. "Put the camera down, kid, just give her a minute." Marcus had done terrible things in his life, but he recognized the sound of a broken heart when he heard it. He pulled out a secure satellite phone and dialed a private number. Miles away, in the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of his penthouse, Justin answered on the first ring. He was standing by the glass wall, staring out at the rain-swept city, the ironed $1 bill resting on the sill in front of him. "Report," Justin commanded. "She's in the park on 5th and Elm," Marcus said, his voice unusually subdued. She's breaking down, boss. Full collapse." "It's bad." Justin closed his eyes. He didn't need the visual. He could feel it. He had read the file. He knew exactly what tomorrow was. He knew the math she was doing in her head. The terrible, inescapable arithmetic of poverty. She tried every pawn shop in the district this morning, Marcus continued. Tried to get a payday loan. Denied. She's out of options. Justin gripped the edge of the windowsill. A physical pain flared in his chest, a ghost ache from 15 years ago. He saw his mother's face in the rain against the glass. He saw the cold, clinical eyes of the hospital administrator telling him that rules were rules. He had watched his mother die because he lacked the power to intervene. He had sworn to be powerful. He had built an empire of fear and blood to ensure he would never feel that helpless again. And yet, here he was, watching a woman fight the exact same battle, using the power he had amassed to do what? Humiliate her? Break her spirit? Prove that he was stronger? Stella wasn't weak. She was the strongest person he had ever met. She was holding up the sky for her brother, and her knees were finally buckling. Boss? Marcus asked over the line, breaking the heavy silence. Do we intervene? Do we pull her in? No, Justin said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its coldness and taking on a terrifying, focused intensity. Stay on her. Make sure she gets home safe. Do not let anyone touch her. Understood. Justin hung up the phone. He turned away from the window and walked back to his desk. He looked at the iron dollar bill. It wasn't a symbol of his power anymore. It was an accusation. It was a mirror showing him the monster he had become. He picked up the phone on his desk, hitting a speed dial button that connected directly to his chief financial officer. David, Justin said, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. I need you to execute a transaction immediately. I don't care what time it is. I don't care who you have to wake up or bribe. He rapidly read off the name of the medical supply company from Stella's file, followed by an account number. I want the account paid in full, Justin ordered. Not just the installment, the entire balance. And I want a 5-year service contract prepaid. Highest priority. Anonymously. If they trace a single cent back to me or this company, you will answer to me personally, do you understand? Yes, sir. Right away, the CFO stammered, terrified by the sudden urgency. Justin hung up the phone. He sank into his leather chair, the silence of the penthouse pressing in on him. He had just spent an exorbitant amount of money on a woman who had insulted him in his own office. He had broken his cardinal rule. Never give something for nothing. But as he sat there, listening to the rain hit the glass, the heavy, suffocating weight that had lived in his chest for 15 years felt, for the first time, marginally lighter. Monday morning broke with a cruel, glaring brightness. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean. But inside apartment 4B, the air was thick with impending doom. Stella sat on the edge of Leo's bed, holding his small, frail hand. She had dressed him in his favorite pajamas, a superhero print that seemed tragically ironic now. The clock on the bedside table read 8:55 a.m. Every time a floorboard creaked in the hallway, Stella's heart seized. She had mentally rehearsed a dozen scenarios. She would beg. She would physically block the door. She would offer to work for them for free for the rest of her life. But she knew none of it would work. Men who came to repossess medical equipment from a child did not deal in empathy. They dealt in ledgers. At exactly 9:02 a.m., a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the small apartment. Stella closed her eyes, a silent sob tearing at her throat. She kissed Leo's forehead, whispered a prayer she wasn't sure she believed in, and stood up. Her legs felt like they were made of water. She walked to the front door, her hand shaking violently as she reached for the deadbolt. She pulled the door open, bracing herself for the sight of men in uniform holding a dolly. Instead, she found a single, terrified-looking man in a cheap suit, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest. He looked at the apartment number, looked at Stella, and swallowed hard. Stella? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. Yes, she said, her voice a hollow whisper. I know why you're here. Please, I just need a few more days. I'll get the money. I swear to God I will get the money. If you take that machine, he dies. The man blinked rapidly, looking horrified. Miss, I'm not here to take the machine. Stella froze. Her brain, geared entirely for survival mode, struggled to process the words. What? The man fumbled with his briefcase, popping the latches and pulling out a thick manila folder. He handed it to her as if it were radioactive. "I'm from Apex Medical Solutions," the man said, rushing his words as if he wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. "I'm here to deliver your updated paperwork. Your account. It's been zeroed out." Stella stared at the folder in her hands, afraid to open it. Zeroed out? What does that mean? A mistake? No mistake, the man said, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill in the hallway. A wire transfer came through at 6 a.m. It covered the past due balance, the principal on the equipment, and it prepaid a platinum tier service and maintenance contract for the next 5 years. "You own the machine outright, miss, and we'll be sending a tech tomorrow to upgrade the filtration system to the newest model. Free of charge." The hallway seemed to tilt violently. Stella leaned against the doorframe, the folder slipping from her hands and spilling papers onto the floor. She saw the large, red stamp on the invoices. Paid in full. "Who?" Stella gasped, her lungs struggling to pull in air. "Who paid it?" "It was an anonymous trust," the man said quickly, backing away toward the stairs. "We don't have a name. We were just instructed to hand-deliver the confirmation and assure you that your brother's care will not be interrupted. Have a good day, miss." He turned and practically ran down the stairs. Stella sank to her knees on the dirty floorboard, staring at the scattered papers. Paid in full. The mountain that had been crushing her chest for 2 years was suddenly, violently ripped away. She could breathe. Leo was safe. He was safe for 5 years. A wave of profound, euphoric relief washed over her, so strong it made her dizzy. Tears streamed down her face. Tears of joy, of exhaustion, of absolute salvation. But as the initial shock faded, the cold, calculating instinct that had kept her alive kicked in. An anonymous trust. A massive, untraceable wire transfer. 5 years of prepaid service. There was only one man in the city with the power, the money, and the sudden, inexplicable interest in her life to pull a string that massive. Justin. The relief vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying dread. Justin didn't do charity. Men like him didn't save people. They bought them. He had watched her struggle. He had humiliated her. And now, he had stepped in to play God. He had paid her debt, which meant, in his world, she now belonged to him. It was a golden cage, but a cage nonetheless. He was proving his point from the restaurant. He had the power, and she was merely a pawn on his board. Stella gathered the papers, her hands no longer shaking with fear, but trembling with a white-hot fury. She would not be bought. She would not let the man who threw a wet dollar at her become her savior. She walked back into the apartment, looked at her peacefully sleeping brother, and made a decision. She was going back to the lion's den. And this time, she wasn't bringing a dollar. She was bringing a war. The rain had returned by evening, a torrential downpour that turned the city streets into rivers of black glass. Stella didn't care. She marched through the lobby of the Apex Tower, drenched to the bone, her wet hair plastered to her face, her eyes burning with an intensity that made the security guards instinctively step back. They didn't try to stop her this time. Marcus, standing near the elevator bank, took one look at her face, nodded slightly, and pressed the button for the penthouse express. He knew she was coming. The elevator doors slid open. The penthouse was dim, lit only by the city lights bleeding through the massive glass wall and the warm glow of a single lamp on the obsidian desk. Justin was standing by the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, watching the storm. He didn't turn around as she stepped out of the elevator. Stella walked straight to the desk. She didn't shout. She didn't scream. She reached into her coat, pulled out the thick folder from the medical company, and slammed it down on the polished stone with a crack that echoed through the cavernous room like a gunshot. "How dare you?" Stella hissed, her voice shaking with raw, unadulterated rage. Justin slowly turned around. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes were guarded. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me." Stella stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at him. "Anonymous trust? Highest priority? You think you can buy my life? You think because you couldn't break me with $1, you could own me with 50,000? I didn't buy you," Justin said quietly, taking a step toward her. The guards in the shadows shifted, but he raised a hand, stopping them instantly. "Then what is this?" Stella demanded, gesturing wildly at the folder. "What do you want from me? You want me to work for you? You want me to be your pet project? A toy you can fix so you can feel like a god? I want your brother to breathe." Justin's voice suddenly boomed, shattering his calm facade. The sheer volume and raw emotion in his shout startled Stella into silence. He closed the distance between them, slamming his own hands onto the desk, leaning over it until he was inches from her face. His eyes, usually dead and cold, were burning with a fierce, terrifying pain. "I don't want anything from you," Justin said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. "I don't want your gratitude. I don't want your submission. I don't want you to work for me." "Then why?" Stella challenged, refusing to back down, though her heart was hammering wildly against her ribs. "Men like you don't do things for nothing." Justin stared at her, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken trauma. He looked away, his jaw clenching, fighting a war within himself. He walked back to the window, leaning his forehead against the cold glass. 15 years ago, Justin began, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain against the pane. "My mother got sick. Something with her heart. They had a treatment. Experimental. It cost $75,000. Cash up front. I was 19. I worked in a loading dock." Stella froze, her anger suddenly dissipating, replaced by a shocking, chilling realization. "I begged," Justin continued, his voice devoid of emotion, a man reciting a nightmare. "I got on my knees in front of the hospital board. I offered to work off the debt for the rest of my life. They looked at me. They looked at me exactly the way I looked at you in that restaurant. Like I was dirt. Like my mother's life was a bad investment. She died 2 days later." He turned slowly to face her. The Mafia boss, the monster who ruled the city, was gone. Standing in his place was a broken boy who had never stopped bleeding. "I promised myself I would never be powerless again," Justin said softly. "I built this empire so no one could ever look down on me. I became the monster because the monster doesn't have to beg. But when you walked into this office, when you put that iron dollar bill on my desk, I realized something." He walked back to the desk. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crisp, ironed $1 bill. He placed it gently on top of the medical folder. "I realized that I had become the men in the hospital boardroom," Justin whispered. "I threw that dollar at you to make you feel small, because I am terrified of feeling small. I watched you fighting for your brother. I saw the eviction notices. I saw the medical bills. I watched you breaking in the rain yesterday." Stella gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. He had been watching her. He had seen her at her absolute lowest. "You are fighting the war I lost," Justin said, his eyes locking onto hers, pleading for her to understand. "You were going to lose your brother because of a piece of paper with numbers on it. I couldn't save my mother. But I could save him. I didn't do it to own you, Stella. I did it because if I let another innocent person die for lack of money while I sit in this glass tower, then my soul is already dead." The anger drained out of Stella completely, leaving behind a profound, aching sorrow. She looked at the hardened criminal in front of her, the man who had ordered hits and ruined lives, and saw only a mirrored reflection of her own desperate pain. They were two sides of the exact same coin, separated only by the choices they made in the dark. "You can't buy absolution, Justin," Stella said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I know," he replied, a single, bitter tear tracing down his cheek. "But I can buy oxygen. Take the files. Go home to your brother. You never have to see me again." He turned his back on her, returning to the window, disappearing back into the shadows of his own making. Stella stood at the desk for a long time. She looked at the ironed dollar bill. She didn't take it. She took the medical files, turned around, and walked to the elevator. As the doors closed, she looked at his silhouette against the city lights. He wasn't a god. He wasn't a monster. He was just a ghost, haunted by a past he couldn't change, desperately trying to rewrite a story that had ended long ago. 3 years passed. The city, like all cities, moved on, chewing up the weak and elevating the strong. But a subtle, undeniable shift had occurred in its dark underbelly. The apex tower still stood, tall and imposing, but the business conducted within its walls had changed. The rumors on the street were confusing to the old guard. Justin's syndicate had slowly, methodically backed out of the predatory lending, the protection rackets, and the violent turf wars. Instead, Apex Logistics had morphed into a legitimate monolith. The muscle still existed, but it was used to enforce peace, to protect union workers, to silence the cartels trying to move drugs into the city's vulnerable neighborhoods. Justin hadn't gone soft. He had simply redirected his ruthlessness toward a different kind of enemy. On a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, Stella walked into the lobby of the Apex Tower. She wasn't wearing a cheap thrift store suit. She wore a sharp, tailored blazer, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. She walked with a quiet, undeniable authority. The security guards didn't stop her. Marcus, standing by the desk, gave her a warm, respectful nod. "He's expecting you, Miss Stella," Marcus said, pressing the button for the express elevator. "Thank you, Marcus." "And how is your daughter doing in college?" she asked smoothly. "Straight A's." "Thanks to the scholarship fund, ma'am." Stella smiled and stepped into the elevator. The ascent was still fast, but it no longer terrified her. When the doors opened to the penthouse, the room was flooded with natural light. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the past was gone. Justin was sitting at his desk, reviewing a stack of architectural blueprints. He looked older, a few streaks of gray at his temples, but the cold, dead look in his winter ocean eyes had been replaced by a sharp, focused clarity. He looked up and smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Stella, right on time. I have the quarterly reports for the foundation," Stella said, walking to the desk and laying a thick, bound portfolio in front of him. She wasn't a waitress anymore. After Leo's health stabilized, Stella had gone to night school, earning a degree in nonprofit management. Justin had approached her a year later, not with a threat or a bribe, but with a job offer. He had created a massive, heavily funded foundation dedicated to providing emergency medical grants to families facing crushing healthcare debts. He needed someone ruthless, compassionate, and utterly incorruptible to run it. He needed her. "How are the numbers?" Justin asked, opening the portfolio. "We approved funding for 42 families this month," Stella reported, sitting in the leather chair opposite him. 3 pediatric heart surgeries, a dozen oncology treatments, and a wing expansion for the free clinic on the east side. "We're slightly over budget for the quarter, but your offshore accounts absorbed the overage without a ripple." "Good," Justin said, nodding in satisfaction. "If we're not bleeding money, we're not helping enough people." He closed the portfolio and looked at her. "And how is Leo?" Stella's face softened. "He played in a soccer game this weekend. He was terrible, but he ran the entire field without coughing once. He wants you to come to his birthday party next week. He says you owe him a rematch in chess." Justin chuckled, a sound that would have terrified his enemies but now sounded entirely human. "Tell him I accept the challenge. I'll bring the pizza." A comfortable silence fell between them. They were not friends, not in the traditional sense. Their relationship was forged in the fire of mutual trauma and built on a foundation of absolute, unspoken respect. They were partners, 2 survivors who had found a way to turn their shared pain into a shield for others. Stella stood up to leave, smoothing her blazer. As she turned, her eyes caught something on the wall behind Justin's desk. It was the only piece of art in the entire minimalist office. It was a small, black shadow box frame. Inside, pressed flat against velvet backing, was a single, crisp, slightly faded $1 bill, torn at the corner. Justin noticed her looking at it. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "I look at it every morning," Justin said softly. "It reminds me of the day I was defeated by a waitress." Stella smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "It reminds me of the day a monster decided to become a man." "It's a good reminder," Justin agreed. "It keeps me grounded. It reminds me that all the power in the world is useless if you don't have the dignity to use it right." Stella nodded. She turned and walked toward the elevator. She didn't look back as the doors closed. She didn't need to. She knew exactly who she was leaving behind. A man who had tried to buy her dignity for $1, only to find that she had given him back his soul for free. True power isn't measured by how many people you can force to look down, but by how many people you can help lift up. Stella and Justin's story proves that dignity is not a commodity that can be bought, sold, or stripped away by arrogance. Sometimes, the smallest act of defiance, returning a single dollar bill, can shatter a world built on fear and spark a transformation that changes countless lives. We all face moments where the world tries to make us feel small, but our worth is defined by our own resilience. If this story moved you, please hit the like button, share this powerful message with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more dramatic, real-life stories. Let us know in the comments. What's the bravest thing you've ever done to protect your dignity?